Now bringing on a farmer panel to talk about, from their perspective, similar topics, related to tillage systems. And so we're going to let them introduce themselves. We have three farmers on the show. We're going to introduce them from north to south. So Stephen, you are the farthest north, so you get to go first. If you could just maybe introduce yourself, your name, and tell us just a little bit about your operation to get things started.
Hey, good morning. Steve Schuster, Minto, North Dakota. For those of you who don't know where Minto is, it's about 30 miles north of Grand Forks. I raise about 6 or 7 different crops in the northern Red River Valley, and bought my dad's operation out about 5 years ago and got into strip till in spring of 2020 on pretty heavy, dark, rich, heavy clay soils in the heart of the valley. And we're learning a lot of things along the way, and excited to tell you guys about it and answer any questions.
Thank you, Steve. And now next furthest north, I guess, is Sam in Larimore.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's Sam Landman. I'm from Larimore, North Dakota, which is about 40 miles west of Grand Forks. Where our farm is west of Northwood, north little ways. We farm just outside of the Red River Valley. We have slightly rolling hills on our farm, and crops I grow are primarily wheat and barley and edible beans. We do mix in some corn and soybeans as well. We're minimum till operation. Do some no-till as well. Primarily use a HighSpeed Disc as my preferred method of minimum tillage. I'm excited to see if I can provide some good information today.
Well, thank you, Sam. And rounding out our panel is Lee Troutman in Jamestown. Lee.
Okay, Lee Troutman, Jamestown, North Dakota, no-till farmer with my dad and my brother. We've been in no-till for 15 years or so. Incorporated cover crops about 10 years ago. Loamy soils, we raise wheat, soybeans, rye, corn, and yeah.
All right, well, excited to talk to all three of you. We already have some great questions carried over from the last panel, and we just remind everybody tuning in that you can both submit a question through the Q&A icon, and then if we don't get to all of those, we'll ask the panelists to be on for the chat afterwards as well. So make sure you do that, because I think the best questions we're asking are coming from you. So please, by all means, submit those questions. But Steve, maybe we'll start with you. I know you said you're doing some strip tillage. Can you maybe just set the scene for us on what drove you to decide that was the right approach for you where you're located?
Yeah, so the big deal with me is heavy clay soils. So really worried about compaction, wheel tracks, anything we do in the spring, we seem to pay for it up here. So I looked at, going across fields 1, 2, 3 times in the spring, and then trying to seed crops into it, heavy wheel tracks, and, not getting the productivity we wanted out of the land, and large fertilizer bills were still coming no matter what kind of yield I got. So just seemed like shoveling out a lot of money for fertility to then just compact the soil and not be happy with my crop. I looked at my cropping system and looked at my operation and where I want to be in the future, and just said there's got to be a better way. So being part of a group called Next Level with Randy Dowdy and David Hula kind of got me introduced to Soil Warrior, and along with having a demo years back. And I thought, well, no time like the present to jump in and try something.
And what crops are you using that approach on?
So for this spring, we did some spring strip till ahead of sunflowers, and it went really well. For looking forward to 2021, we have strips built for sugar beets, soybeans, corn, edible beans, and this is where you start to think outside the box. I might even seed some wheat in 22-inch rows with my planter, just to learn something.
Very cool. And Sam, you had mentioned the HighSpeed Disc. I know you've compared no-till and HighSpeed Disc. Can you talk about kind of some of the results of what you found there?
Where I farm is quite variable. We have some hills, like I said, that can dry out, and then we have low areas that are problem areas in the spring when we're trying to get the crop in the ground. That's kind of what landed me on the HighSpeed Disc, just doing some spot tillage mostly. I have done some strips comparisons where I would make a no-till strip in the middle of the field that was work completely with the HighSpeed Disc, and then vice versa, where I would make a HighSpeed Disc strip in the middle of a no-till field. And a lot of times I don't see any difference if the moisture conditions at seeding time are favorable. But there is a difference a lot of times if it's, say, wet or dry in spring. And the advantage usually goes to the tillage strips if it's wet in the spring.
Sam, you're putting your tillage strips in the spring, right? You're using the HighSpeed Disc in the spring, but leaving fields covered in the fall?
Yeah, that is correct. I will do some spot tillage in the fall in some known problem areas, or to level out some ruts, or knock down some weedy areas, or just areas that didn't get harvested for whatever reason, to try to make it as easy as possible for us in the spring.
And Lee, I know that you've been doing this a long time, but we did have a question in the last session about just kind of equipment prices and how equipment prices factor into sort of tillage decisions. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit, and then Sam and Steve, if you've also got comments, invite you to weigh in as well. But maybe we'll start with Lee. About the question specifically is, how can you afford to change practices with equipment prices, and what are the cheapest things to change?
Most drills and planters are equipped right off the factory floor to do no-till fields. When we made the transition, we had a Concord drill, and it was time to upgrade the Concord anyways. So we went with a Amity single disc drill. So it wasn't really that we needed to change to do the practice. It was more just to change to keep up with the times and to cover the acres, and the equipment was getting wore out. The planter, we haven't changed anything on our planter from going from the tillage operation to the no-till. I think you have to set things differently. You have to manage things a little differently on the equipment. You can't just set it and forget it. As field conditions change, even from field to field, or even different spots in the field, it is important to get out and actually look at stuff. But I also see a lot of savings because I'm not out there burning up disc blades. I'm not using up chisel plow shanks. I don't have a lot of big, powerful tractors sitting around the yard most of the time. We really do the whole farm operation with a sprayer, and then a tractor, and then a quad track pulls the drill. So we've really only got 3 pieces of equipment that do most of the operation on the farm.
I know you've been doing this, if I remember right, you've been doing this your whole life as far as no-till goes. But what gives you the confidence that it's working? Or what are you looking at to say, like, is this still the right thing, and are we going in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of I would say I'm not kind of an oddball, but I really don't know tillage. I've never pulled, I pull a disc around every once in a while, but really I've never tilled an entire field in my entire life. And so I'm always looking back to see, I don't know what to prove this against, because this is all I've known. No-till is all that I know. This year I did do some high-speed disc passes because I'm running into problems when I drop wheat residue or wheat straw to bale it. I end up getting windrows behind the baler still, and that is affecting and showing up in yield and stand next year in pretty much every crop. So I'm trying to find a way to incorporate that chaff behind the combine a little better. But yeah, I go out. I mean, everybody tells me that I'm crazy, it seems like, especially equipment dealers, that I need to buy this piece of equipment and this thing would do this, and I'll have a better yield with that. And I've tried it. This year I had 3 different tillage pieces on the farm. They did all right, but then I saw the bill for them and it's like, no, there's no way that you can justify that on my farm. So I do like to try things, and I'm very open to just running a piece of equipment at an angle through a field a couple times to see if anything shows up. And so yeah, I do like to try new things like that.
Well, Steve, for you, investing in the strip tillage equipment, can you talk about the economics of that for you?
The strip till rig was obviously a very expensive piece of machinery, but when I ran numbers on just tillage passes for one, sugar beets being an example, we double strip tilled some wheat stubble this fall, and we're hoping just to go right in with the planter in the spring, and we put the fertility down on the second pass. A typical tillage practice for sugar beets would be, and some of you are going to laugh, but it's 5 tillage passes in the fall, or 4 tillage passes plus a fertilizer spreader, and then a lot of times it's 2 more in the spring. So if I can take 7 passes across the field and make it 2, even if I got to touch those strips up in the spring and make it 3, it's still a cost savings there. I was fortunate enough to get involved in cost share stuff through my local NRCS too. So there are ways to help soften the blow on the payments on these big pieces of machinery. And some of the challenges I've found, I could have went and built my own machine. Nothing against anybody that's tried that, but me being very green and coming into this thing, I was really glad to have the serviceability of a company behind me, and there are people to come out and help me set things up. I guess maybe trial and error over years, you learn more, but I guess I don't regret spending the money that I spent on a piece of machinery up to this point. So, and the cost savings are there. I mean, I'm not a big fan of cutting fertilizer rates, but some of the advice I've got from people who've done this before me is go ahead and cut your fertility rates, maybe 10, 15, as much as 20% until you get that equipment paid for, and then go ahead and ratchet those rates back up.
Brings into another really good question that we've gotten from the audience is, you all are trying these new practices and you have side-by-sides and you're doing new things on maybe small fields and then trying it out there. How long do you decide before that practice is worth it or not, or you're going to continue to use it? And maybe let's start with Sam on that, because I'm familiar with your side-by-sides.
I'm sorry about that. I was distracted by my cat running across the wall here.
Oh, funny. Sam, how much time do you give Sam before you decide a practice is going to work or not? When you've been playing with no-till, you've been looking at the HighSpeed Disc in the spring. How do you decide what you're going to do?
I try to do the same experiment twice, and hopefully we have different conditions in those 2 years before I adopt it on a large scale. I started off experimenting with reduced tillage on a 12-acre patch, and expanded it to some other smaller fields close to the farm. And then once, I'm a science guy. I like to see. I have to see that either I'm getting the same yield or a better yield from a change in a practice, or the same profitability or increased profitability from the change in practice before I adopt it to the entire farm. So I guess usually about 2 years.
And is that similar for you, Steve? And I know you tried the strip till on a small piece first. And about how long did it take you to dive in?
I committed pretty hard in the beginning. I just told myself I was going to make this thing work. And a couple of the notes I wrote down previous was just some advice is it's got to be a multi-year commitment with a really open mind. And I looked at some leasing options or even to rent a machine for just a spring. Well, if I had rented the machine just for this spring, I would have given up already. But because I committed myself to it, we got into this fall and had a lot of success with it. And it brings me to another thing I wrote down is don't get so focused on one final goal, because your goal will probably change along the way. And you're gonna think there's reason A, B, C why you went into this, and you're gonna end up with other reasons down the chain somewhere that are gonna make it continue. So don't get too focused on one thing.
Lee, I'm sure that you have had a lot of people approach you and say, boy, I'd like to do what you do, but insert reason here. We have a question from the audience that says, why might a producer be hesitant to transition to these types of practices? I know you've been there your whole life, but I'm sure you've had a lot of people ask you questions and maybe have reasons why they don't know that they could transition the same, to the same thing that you do. What are those reasons that you hear often?
It can't work on my farm is a big one. You have different land than where I'm at, and that can be from people as close as, 5 miles away. I have people say that that can't work on my farm. It just, the soils are different and this is different and it just can't work. So I think it's really just, I in this group, as you can see from the web that Abby had right away, that there's people all over the world that do practices that we're doing and do it successfully. So I don't know that just saying that you can't do it on your farm is acceptable. You just have to try it, and it's probably not going to be the same way that I do it or any of my neighbors do it or anybody else on that web, but finding the way to do it on your farm and make it work is what you got to do.
Yeah, I know you've been kind of open too, where you've taken, and this is about cover crops not reducing tillage, but you've gone over and you spread some rye for some neighbors, or you help out, and that seems pretty common. Well, maybe not as common as we think with growers in this area, where you're showing how these practices may work on somebody else's farm. And what's usually the reception to doing that?
It's kind of mixed. You kind of do it in hopes that maybe having them kind of dabble their toes in the water a little bit, maybe they'll kind of see where you're coming from, and to see that you're actually doing it on their land, not seeing it on my land. I know that's a huge thing even for me. When trying things, it sounds great to see it on somebody else's field, but to actually bring it home and put it on your field makes a world of difference to see it work there. So I've had, everything from good results to maybe people are trying more things or like what, if we've done some cover crops or something on theirs, and other times it's just, it didn't work. It was, it didn't hurt anything, but it didn't really give me any return either. So.
Another question from the audience here, and I'll direct this one at Sam, but Lee and Stephen, if you have any experience with this, maybe you can jump in after Sam. But have any of you considered profitability mapping? So taking acres out of production if they are consistently losing money, within that map. So I don't know. We'll start there with Sam. Have you messed with that at all?
Absolutely. I've done some areas of the field, say 10-acre corner of the field that's a high salinity area, and I've taken it out of crop production because I started losing money on it, and I planted it to alfalfa. If it's not too poor of a ground, it still grow alfalfa. Say it's just too wet or something. My goal is just to break even on those acres and not have it hurt your crop insurance yield, APH. There's just a lot of advantages to doing things like that. Especially with edible beans in our rotation, they're a very sensitive crop to salinity or waterlogged soil. So if I'm running the planter in the spring, I kind of know where those areas are, so I will purposely avoid those areas so that those poor acres don't count against me in the long run. Then I'll maybe come back with some cover crop in those problem areas, or just try to control the weeds in those areas throughout the year, and not have to spend the inputs on fertilizer, chemical, and the normal crop inputs, I guess, on those poor areas.
And Stephen, it sounds like for you, your land may be a little bit more uniform than Sam's is, so maybe he might experience some of those issues more. But is that something that you look at as well?
Yeah, it is. We've been using variable rate fertility and seeding maps, as a lot of people have for years. So that's in a sense an effect to what the question is asking. But a lot of square fields, square quarters here. But what I've done is I've taken maybe 150 acre field and farmed 110 acres of it one way, and the sour 40 acres on the end of it differently. Maybe I'll just put sunflowers and barley into a poor end of the field, and the rest would be edible beans and corn and such. And as far as taking stuff out of production, one of the NRCS programs I got into is doing just that. We're taking a 6 acre, I'll call it a waterway or drainage ditch, out of a full quarter. We're going to plant 6 acres into a native grass for 5 years. as part of an NRCS program. So we're starting to look at those things on a small scale, and that's outside the box thinking for this area. To actually pick up and not farm through something is pretty odd around here.
And Stephen, I know I asked this to Lee earlier, but I want to ask you as well, which is, how do you know from a tillage standpoint that it's working? You said instantly you were able to reduce your passes. I think you said from like 7 to 2 or maybe 3, which is an obvious one from the outset. But long term, what are you tracking to evaluate if you're heading in the right direction?
You mentioned profitability mapping, and that's where it's at for me. It's all about, it's not necessarily about getting the highest yield. It's about having the most profit from the yield that you are getting, and controlling risk. That's probably the biggest thing for me, is try to cut some of those inputs back, or not necessarily cut them, but be more efficient with them. One of the challenges I've found with strip till is, we start wheat harvest here in early August. Well, you can't start putting down nitrogen in August. So we went to more split applications. It's been more equipment investment on the planter and side dress equipment, stuff like that. But it's reducing risk and analyzing the year that Mother Nature's giving you, and then adapting to that along the way. So it's a risk assessment thing for me.
Looks like we do have another question coming in. But before we get to that one, I want to take things back to Sam for just a minute. And now, Sam, for you, with the variability, has there been anything that just hasn't worked? I know you mentioned kind of a few things that you've tried, but anything you could tell us from a tillage standpoint, it's maybe worked for someone else, but for whatever reason, it doesn't work for you?
It depends on the year. We have certain problem fields that are always wet. Say, we're on the slope of the valley, some of our fields, and there's springs and whatnot that come up in groundwater that you just can't do anything about. And when you're trying to no-till, say, for example, soybeans into a heavy barley stubble from the previous year, I've had trouble with doing that in a timely manner. So you're always up against the clock in farming, right? You have a short timing or a short window for getting the crop in and get the highest potential yield out of it. So for me, it just comes down to if it's wet, we do a little bit of scratching around in the ground and before we seed it. But if not, if it's dry, we can no-till into it. But I wouldn't force no-tilling just to no-till in my situation. That's where I've had problems.
So here's another great question from the audience, and I'm not asking this to get you guys to say to come to Abby Wick's programs, but somebody asked, do you have local groups of farmers you talk with for ideas, or where might you find some support for some of these practices? I think it's pretty common in some of these soil health practices that you're in your areas alone, that not everybody is doing what you're doing because you're on the leading edge of some of these changes and practices. And so, Lee, let's start with you on where do you go for some support as you try new ideas?
Dr. Abby Wick.
All right, good answer.
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky though. I mean, we kind of have a small little group here. Tony Wagner, who's going to talk later today, he's just down the road from me, and then Lee Breeze is my crop consultant and has been for a long time. So the three of us bounce ideas all the time, and yeah, with you too. And then kind of some of the other smaller groups that we've kind of built relationships by coming to meetings like this, usually in person. You get contact information, and then you might randomly throw a text message to somebody someday, and you just kind of build a network that way. You just bounce ideas off of people. Sometimes you might come up with something crazy and you just want somebody to bounce it off of, to say, hey, I want to do this, but I want to make it work. How do you think I should do it to make it work? Even if the chances of it working are slim to none, how do you think we should go about it to make it work?
Similar question for Sam. You mentioned kind of being a science guy earlier. Where do you go to make sure that you have kind of the latest when it comes to the science behind the practices you're trying out?
I don't know. A lot of times I get my ideas from neighbors that are trying things, or Twitter, or I'm a scientist in the the idea that I like the scientific process, the experimentation and that kind of thing. I don't particularly get my information from one source. I mean, obviously Abby is a great contact, working with her, with the shared farm and everything. I do get lots of communication with her and the other industry researchers that way.
Great. Well, we're coming up on time and not too long, so I do want to give everyone at least one more chance to get a final word in on, just in general on tillage and how you've handled it and what you think might be valuable to other farmers that might be listening out there. So, Steve, let's start with you. Just give you a chance. I know you prepared some thoughts. Anything that we didn't get to that you're hoping to talk about?
Being prepared, like for strip till, in my case, is you're going to fix one problem, but you're going to create another one. And I talked about the nitrogen, getting the nitrogen down, and that we went down the road of precision plantings, conceal, and we'd already been doing some side dress, but we had to put guidance on our planter, things like that. It was just, you created another headache sometimes. And so it's hard to think forward that far to see what those problems are going to be. But so you're going to have to work through those, but just don't be afraid to test things. Abby and I talked about the aha moment that I had in like 2017. I just kind of tried something off the wall that wasn't supposed to work, and it did, and that's what sent me down this road. And just back to the where do you share information from, or who do you get information from? I was really lucky that I have a neighbor who adopted the same practice that I did at the same time, and have some friends from college that are consultants. Use those networks. There's some of the things you learned in college, some of the people you met in college are the people you can now reach back to, even if you haven't talked to them for 10 years. Use those people as your crutches through a lot of this stuff.
Well, I'm hearing that there's a lot of ideas being shared in the chat, so please keep that going. But I want to give Lee a chance for some final words as well.
Yeah, just don't be scared to try new things. I tried different things weekly, it seems like, and just if a random idea pops in your head, find a way to put it into a small scale test. I mean, I'm going to go out later today and put some soybean seed and corn seed in the ground to see what happens. I don't know, but it doesn't have to be huge. Doesn't have to even be, field scale. I'm just going to go dig a hole with my hand and see what happens. You never know. And sometimes great ideas come from places you never would have imagined.
And Sam, you get the final word here this morning.
All right. For anyone starting off with reduced tillage, I would advise them to start by improving your field drainage, your surface drainage. First, the faster you can get that water moving off the field in the spring, the faster you can get into it. It just helps tremendously in a minimum till environment. And then with reduction in tillage, sometimes there's a perceived compaction issue that you might have, and the ground firms up. But for me, that's benefited me because of the increased trafficability. And then I would say any increase in moisture holding capacity trumps any perceived compaction that you might have. Or think that you may have in your field.
Well, thank you so much, guys. Stephen, Sam, Lee, very, very, very informative.